Hello YouTube! In this video I want to outline voluntarism in epistemology. Voluntarism is an account of rationality which has been developed by Bas van Fraassen, and I think it's pretty interesting. It's certainly been influential on my own views. But a lot of the work on voluntarism is quite technical, and it's scattered around lots of different books and papers. There isn't really a manifesto of voluntarism available. So I'm just going to try to introduce some of the basic ideas here. The guiding question here is, what is rationality? What are the constraints on rational belief? In the traditional approach to epistemology, rationality is a matter of applying inference rules that are universally compelling. So traditional epistemology tries to uncover the rules of belief formation, where these rules determine a unique set of beliefs in response to any given evidence. So two agents, assuming they've been exposed to the exact same evidence and arguments, should draw the same conclusions. If you take induction, for instance, the vindication of induction would proceed by trying to show how all agents are rationally compelled to make certain inductive inferences given the evidence. Such as, we're rationally compelled to infer that the sun will rise tomorrow. So traditional epistemology thinks of rationality as being a matter of what you are obligated to believe. For Van Fraassen and the voluntarists, rationality is a matter of permission, not obligation. A rational agent may believe anything that she's not rationally compelled to disbelieve. So rationality doesn't tell us what to believe. It doesn't determine some unique set of beliefs. It just imposes certain boundaries on beliefs. And more precisely, according to Van Fraassen, the only constraint on rational belief is that the set of beliefs of a rational agent must be such that they do not sabotage their own possibility of vindication. So rationality equals no self-sabotage. And in practice, this means that our set of beliefs must be consistent. They must conform to deductive logic and to the axioms of probability theory. And these are the only constraints on rational belief. So if a set of beliefs is logically consistent and conforms to probability theory, then it is rational. Provided we're consistent, then we can believe basically whatever we want, right? How much we believe, what we believe, how we change our beliefs in response to the evidence, right? All of that is outside the boundaries of rationality. To sum it up, as Paul Teller does in his article Learning to Live with Voluntarism, he says, what is rational is anything that rationality does not forbid, and the only thing that rationality forbids is inconsistency. So obviously then, the principles of rationality do not compel any particular set of beliefs in response to the evidence, or indeed any particular set of rules for interpreting and evaluating the evidence. Voluntarism treats sets of beliefs as constrained by logic, but beyond that it's a matter of personal values, emotions, preferences, in other words, the passions. So consistency provides the boundaries, but what we are actually driven to believe within the boundaries of consistency is a matter of our passions, our emotions, and other sort of irrational factors. And there are no rules that determine what you ought to believe in response to the evidence. Now, no doubt the most controversial aspect of voluntarism is its permissiveness. But voluntarism does include some constraints on rational belief, and I suppose it's worth briefly noting what work they are doing. Under voluntarism, rationality requires us to avoid self-sabotage. It must be possible, by the lights of our own beliefs, for those beliefs to be vindicated, for them to turn out to be true. So, first of all, the voluntarist requires that our set of beliefs be logically consistent. The reason should be fairly obvious, right? If you were to believe both P and not P, then it's not possible for both of those beliefs to turn out to be true. You have adopted a set of beliefs such that one of them must be wrong, and in that way you've sabotaged yourself. If I believe both that Frank Zappa wrote Joe's Garage and that Frank Zappa did not write Joe's Garage, well, no investigation into the world, no set of background assumptions, nothing could vindicate both of those beliefs. So I know that I have sabotaged myself. And so rationality requires us not to do that. Then second, there's probabilistic coherence. So the degrees of belief that you assign to any set of propositions must conform to the axioms of probability theory, listed here. Now, it can be shown that if your degrees of belief violate these axioms, then you will render yourself liable to what are known as Dutch books. A Dutch book is a series of bets that are fair according to your probability assignments, but which guarantee that you will lose money no matter what happens. Here's a simple example of how Dutch book arguments work. Suppose I take the proposition, it will rain on Monday, to have a probability of 0.8. Well, in that case, I should be willing to pay £8 to enter a bet that pays out £10 if that proposition is true. Or, well, maybe I won't be willing to enter it, but the point is, given my probability assignment, that is a fair bet, because the expected value of that bet would be 0. So it's a completely fair bet from my point of view. But now suppose I take it that it is not the case that it will rain on Monday, also has a probability of 0.8. Obviously this straightforwardly violates the probability axioms because those two propositions are mutually exclusive, yet the sum of their probabilities is greater than 1. Anyway, given that I assign 0.8 to it is not the case that it will rain on Monday, similarly, it is a fair bet to pay £8 for a prize, for a bet that will pay out a £100 prize if that proposition is true. So overall then, I'm paying £8 for a £10 payout if the first proposition is true, and £8 for a £10 payout if the second proposition is true. But clearly, if I make both bets, I'm guaranteed to lose money. I'll be paying £16 to enter both bets, and I'll get £10 back. It's a guaranteed loss, no matter whether no matter whether it's true or false that it will rain on Monday. Now, it has been proven in what's called the Dutch book theorem that no Dutch book can be made against somebody whose degrees of belief obey the probability calculus, and a Dutch book can always be made against somebody whose degrees of belief fail to obey the probability calculus. Obeying the probability calculus is necessary and sufficient for avoiding Dutch books, and so that's the only way to avoid sabotaging your own chances of success. Okay then, so failure to conform to deductive logic and probability theory leads to self-sabotage and is therefore irrational. This much is not likely to be too controversial. The controversial claim is that these are the only constraints on rational belief. So, why does Van Fraassen think this? Well, Van Fraassen, he says that, so Van Fraassen says that support for voluntarism comes from essentially two sources. First of all, the failure of traditional rule-governed epistemology, and second, reflection on our everyday and scientific practice. I think these points are sort of intertwined, and both also connect to a third point, which is that voluntarism, like most views in epistemology, it can be best understood as a response to the challenge of skepticism. Because the trouble with traditional epistemology is precisely that, at least according to Van Fraassen, it just doesn't provide the resources for a convincing response to skepticism. The problem of skepticism is the problem of how we can have any knowledge at all. There's the classic skeptical argument against the external world. If I don't know I'm not a brain in a vat, I don't know I have hands. I don't know I'm not a brain in a vat, so I don't know I have hands. Obviously, you can plug in whatever skeptical hypothesis you like there. Brain in a vat, Descartes' evil demon, dreaming, whatever, right? So the skeptic says, look, all of your evidence, indeed all of your possible evidence, all evidence you could possibly have is compatible with the proposition that you're a brain in a vat. No matter what experiences you have, it might always be a hallucination generated by brilliant neuroscientists playing around with your brain. So you have no way of ruling out the hypothesis that you're a brain in a vat. And that means you have no way of knowing that you're not. You have no way of knowing that there is actually an external world. So, since you have no justification for believing in an external world, belief in an external world is irrational. Anything, like if I was to say, why do you have hands? Well, I can of course appeal to various factors justifying that belief, but the skeptic will say, well, they're all compatible with this skeptical hypothesis, so actually that justification just doesn't work. Again, classic skeptical argument, familiar to anyone interested in philosophy. Now, as Van Fraassen tells it then, the skeptic is going to make 4 claims. Skepticism is going to consist in 4 propositions. So first is the claim that there is no independent justification for continuing to believe what we already find ourselves believing. Again, as I said, of course we can give reasons for what we believe. Right? I can give reasons for believing that I have hands, but these, any of these reasons are just going to turn out to be circular or unjustified. For instance, if I say that the reason I believe I have hands is that I can see my hands, well, I'm just assuming that perception is generally reliable. But that's precisely what the skeptic is challenging with skeptical hypotheses like the brain in the vat hypothesis. Second, the skeptic will say it is irrational to maintain an unjustified belief. Third, there is no independent justification for any ampliative extrapolation of evidence plus previous opinion to the future. And this is ruling out any justification for inductive inference. Fourth, it is irrational to ampliate without justification. So then Van Fraassen distinguishes two different approaches to skepticism. We might accept the skeptic's demand that our beliefs require this kind of justification. And so then we attempt to find what this justification consists in. If you think of something like classical foundationalism, for instance, well, this attempts to find the indubitable basic beliefs upon which the rest of our knowledge is constructed. Think of how the traditional empiricists appealed to sense data, right? I can doubt that there is a red cup in front of me, but I cannot doubt that I'm experiencing a sensation of redness. And then on the basis of the sense data, the things that are indubitable, that we're directly aware of in perception, we then apply various rules of inference to form other beliefs. And perhaps, we can't hold those other beliefs with absolute certainty, but, there are certain beliefs that we can rationally hold, provided we've applied the right rules of inference. We ought not to believe that which has not been generated by appropriate rules, and we ought to believe that which has been so generated. The response to skepticism would then proceed by showing how we can rely on such beliefs, and how the application of certain inference rules leads to reliable beliefs. So traditional epistemology accepts propositions 2 and 4. So in this way, the traditional epistemologist accepts the framework of the skeptic's challenge. So, propositions 2 and 4, it's irrational to maintain unjustified belief, it's irrational to ampliate without justification. The traditional epistemologist accepts these, and then takes on the task of searching for the justification of our beliefs. Obviously the traditional epistemologist thinks she can do this, and so rejects propositions 1 and 3. Now, Van Fraassen, basically agrees with, he takes it that the skeptical attacks on traditional epistemology have been successful. Obviously, it would take a whole video series to discuss this point in any detail, but I guess it's easy enough to state the basic ideas here. So let's take induction. The practice of extrapolating from our present beliefs and evidence to beliefs about the as yet unobserved. Well, induction in general faces the standard Humean dilemma. What justifies induction? The justification will be either deductive or inductive, but clearly there can't be a deductive justification. When I infer that the sun will rise tomorrow, that can't be true just as a matter of logic. On the other hand, any inductive justification of induction will be question-begging. If I was to say, induction has been reliable in the past, therefore it will be reliable tomorrow, that presupposes, that very inference presupposes that induction is reliable, because it's an inductive inference, right? So, I have a video on Hume's problem of induction, if you're interested in more there, but, again, this is a fairly familiar point. But moreover, even if we were to put to one side the problem of justifying induction, there's actually a deeper difficulty here, which I think is probably, again, this is perhaps more important for the purposes of voluntarism, which is that nobody has ever actually been able to specify just what the inductive rules that we supposedly use actually are. So let's take the sort of standard one that we're often presented with, or at least one of the standard ones that we're presented with. All observed Fs are Gs, so probably all Fs are Gs. Well, what Van Fraassen will say is, look, actually, nobody ever actually applies this rule. Indeed, this rule would, if we were to apply it, support a variety of really stupid inferences. So let's say we're talking about a child, Verity, and we say Verity's height has increased each year so far, so probably Verity's height will increase every year. That's completely idiotic, and these kinds of stupid inferences can be multiplied endlessly. So in fact then, this standard inductive rule has not even been successful in the past. Or at least it wouldn't have been successful in the past if people had used it. In practice, nobody does use this rule. The rules that we use, assuming that there are rules, they must be much more complicated than this. So one issue here is that we don't know what these rules are even supposed to be, that we are supposedly applying. And there is a more general problem with the notion of inductive rules, which has been pointed out by Nelson Goodman. Again, I have a video on Goodman's problem of induction that you should check out for more detail here. Consider the inference, all emeralds observed so far are green, therefore probably all emeralds are green. Now Goodman introduces the predicate GRU, where X is GRU means either, number one, X is observed before 2030 and is green, or 2, X is not observed before 2030 and is blue. Now, just as all emeralds observed so far are green, it's also the case that all emeralds observed so far are GRU, because anything that's green that's observed before 2030 is GRU by definition, right? So by definition, all the emeralds that we've observed so far are GRU. But then if we plug this in to our inductive rule, then we get the inference, all emeralds observed so far are GRU, therefore probably all emeralds are GRU. And yet what this means, right, if we accept that all emeralds are GRU, what this means is that the emeralds that we observe after 2030 will be blue. Again, by the definition of the term GRU. Again, if this is confusing, go and watch the video on Goodman where I explain it in more detail. The point is, what Goodman's problem seems to show is that for any successful inductive inference, there are going to be an infinite number of inductive inferences that mirror the inference but that will fail. So we have a successful inductive inference using the predicate green, but there's going to be an infinite number of unsuccessful inferences using deviant predicates like blue. And so this kind of problem is going to arise for whatever we say the inductive rules are. So if our inductive practices are successful, it's not through the application of general rules, because any inductive rule must fail infinitely more often than it succeeds. Okay, so yeah, as I say, you can go and check out the videos on Hume and Goodman if you're not familiar with them. But I mean, hopefully you can see then that, like, why we might think that traditional epistemology is just hopeless, and certainly in the case of something like induction, right? So the second approach to skepticism is to reject the skeptic's demand for justification. And this approach can be seen in philosophers who are more inclined to pragmatism. So, the view here is going to be, we are raised with various beliefs about the world, and in most cases there's no particular reason to doubt them. And although any given belief can be doubted, any particular belief can be doubted, these doubts will always be based on other beliefs that we're taking as fixed for the purposes of our inquiry. All inquiry has to start somewhere, and really the only place it can start is with whatever set of beliefs we happen to have already. So the most that we can do is test our beliefs against the evidence, search our beliefs for potential tensions and inconsistencies, which we might then remove. But, in doing all of this, we have no choice but to rely, to sort of take fixed a whole bunch of our background opinion. So, you know, I believe that there's a cup on the table. Why do I believe this? Well, because I can see the cup before me. At this point, the burden is on the skeptic to undermine this, and she needs to provide reasons to doubt that belief that are relevant given the context. You know, so yes, skeptics can always provide some reasons for doubt, right? They can appeal to the skeptical hypotheses like brain in a vat. But these reasons do not usually involve any factors that are actually relevant to me. So the fact that I might be a brain in a vat is not relevant to any practical concerns, and indeed it is, as the skeptic herself points out, impossible for anybody to refute, right? There's no way of testing it one way or the other. But then why should I care about it? So, you know, under this way of thinking, under this way of approaching epistemology, the kind of justification that the skeptic demands is not a justification that any of us is actually under a rational obligation to provide, right? It is perfectly rational to just, you know, sort of continue with the beliefs that you have been, that you find yourself with. You know, we have various beliefs, various ways of reasoning about our beliefs that have been handed down by community and tradition, and then we attempt to strengthen these beliefs by removing incoherencies and by adding newer, more powerful beliefs and newer, more powerful methods. Otto Neurath's boat is the standard metaphor here. So to quote Neurath, "We are like sailors who, on the open sea, must reconstruct their ship, but are never able to start afresh from the bottom. When a beam is taken away, a new one must at once be put there, and for this the rest of the ship is used as support. In this way, by using the old beams and driftwood, the ship can be shaped entirely anew, but only by gradual reconstruction." So, you know, we need that kind of background body of opinion that we're sort of that sort of holds us in place while we engage in reconstructing more specific parts of our opinion. Or as Van Fraassen puts it, and I quote, "Rationality will consist not in having a specially good starting point, but in how well we criticise, amend and update our given condition." Again, so this should be a fairly familiar idea. It's common among pragmatists and coherentists. It also forms the basis of voluntarism. With respect to the 4 skeptical propositions, voluntarism accepts propositions 1 and 3, but rejects 2 and 4. So according to voluntarism, there is nothing irrational, either in relying on our present opinions, even though no independent justification can be given for them, nor is there anything irrational about making ampliative inferences to the future, even though, again, there is no independent justification that can be given for that. So voluntarism just rejects the skeptic's challenge, and it turns traditional epistemology completely on its head. So a major influence on Van Fraassen's voluntarism is William James's writings on epistemology. In particular, Van Fraassen draws on James's point that when we reflect on our epistemic practices, we find that all people are guided by 2 goals. First, the goal of maximising true beliefs, and second, the goal of minimising false beliefs. I suppose that ideally we would like to believe all and only the true propositions. Maybe that's an ideal for some people, but of course these 2 goals of searching for truth and of avoiding error will pull us in different directions, because by increasing our information content, by allowing more true beliefs through the net, we also thereby place ourselves at a higher risk of believing some false things. By contrast, we could minimise false belief by simply refraining from believing anything at all, but that would land us in a debilitating skepticism. So we need to find a way to balance these goals, right? We want a well-balanced body of belief which gives us a useful amount of information about the world, enough information to execute our practical goals and enough information to satisfy our desire for explanation or whatever, but that's also appropriately critical and skeptical. And James's point is that even though truth and falsehood may be determined by nature, the balance between these goals can only be given by us. There is nothing in the world that would tell us how to balance these goals. There is no objective fact about how to balance these goals. It is a matter of temperament. It's a matter of the passions. Some people will tend to be cautious, some will tend to be bold, some will tend to be contrarian. There's nothing irrational about this. Rationality sets the boundaries of acceptable belief, but then like how far we go and in what direction we go, again, we're going to be driven by the passions. And choices enter at other stages as well. For one thing, I mean, we don't really have the desire to just believe truth across the board, because our minds and our lives are finite, so we have to be selective. We want information about the things that we consider relevant. And, you know, for any individual, there's going to be many things they just don't care about, so it doesn't matter if they hold no opinion on those matters. Along the same lines, how exactly we balance the goals of believing truth and avoiding falsehood will depend on the context. The threat of false beliefs differs depending on the domain. So it probably doesn't make any practical difference if you hold false beliefs about, you know, metaethics or the existence of God, but false beliefs about the effect of a drug could be a bit of a problem. So, you know, when balancing the desire for information against the threat of false beliefs, we have to consider what the information is about and how that's relevant to our lives. And again, this is something that is supplied by us, and this is something that's dependent on our values. No principle of rationality can tell us how to make these choices, because no principle of rationality can dictate what matters to us. It's, again, this is us. We decide what matters to us. Choices, you know, so the beliefs we end up with are going to be based on values, policies, preferences, and this is something that voluntarism accommodates. So I just want to briefly consider how, you know, this sort of thing plays out in the case of an inductive inference, one inductive inference. Van Fraassen doesn't use this example, but I think it's illustrative. So remember, traditional epistemology tries to understand inductive inference in terms of rationally compelling rules. Now, we do need to make inductions, because we need to form expectations about the future. This is just something that, you know, every human will do. So, how does this work without rationally compelling rules? Well, suppose it's the early days of chemistry, and I have measured the melting point of bismuth to be about 271 degrees centigrade. Now, first of all, we can imagine the Goodman-style skeptic coming along and saying, well, you know, what grounds are there for talking about bismuth rather than, you know, some deviant predicate such as mismuth, where, you know, it's observed before 2030 and is bismuth, or is observed after 2030 and is mercury, you know, whatever, right? Well, you know, look, I have a certain body of prior opinion, a certain way of thinking about the world, a certain way of classifying things in the world. Now, of course, I can't give any, you know, independent justification for my general body of opinion as a whole, but it's served me well enough so far, and that's good enough. You know, in the vast majority of cases, every person will follow the path of least resistance and will continue working with the opinions that they've been brought up with. Change is hard, after all. So if a set of beliefs and concepts is serving me reasonably well, I proceed with them. And, you know, I've been inculcated with the concept of bismuth and temperature and, you know, melting point and etc., etc. So when performing this action of measurement, I think of it in terms of measuring the melting point of bismuth. Okay, then, I've measured the melting point of bismuth to be 271 degrees. What should I infer from this? Well, I might draw any number of conclusions. So I might draw the conclusion that all samples of bismuth melt at 271 degrees, or that all samples of bismuth in these environmental conditions melt at 271 degrees. And obviously, there are going to be different ways of filling in the phrase "in these environmental conditions." Right? Different things will count as relevantly similar environmental conditions, and that will lead to different inferences. Or I might infer most samples of bismuth in these environmental conditions melt at 271 degrees. Or I might just refuse to draw any general conclusion at all about bismuth. I might worry that bismuth is not really a natural kind, but instead refers to 2 or 3 or 4 completely different things, completely different, you know, minerals or elements or whatever that happen to have similar observable properties, just as jade turned out to refer to both jadeite and nephrite. And of course, in this case, my measurements of bismuth, I wouldn't be able to generalize them. Other samples of bismuth might behave totally differently. Okay, then, so from a voluntarist point of view, any of these inferences are acceptable. And an individual may have pragmatic reasons to favour one or the other. Somebody who's attracted to Popper's view that science proceeds through bold, risky conjectures open to falsification, that kind of person would probably favour the first inference, because it's the strongest and the riskiest. Other people, perhaps more moved by how we have discovered that other materials have shown a dependence of melting point on pressure, and perhaps less willing to take a risk with their beliefs, would only draw a conclusion about how bismuth under similar pressures will behave. And so on. Now, the key point is that this is how inference actually works. That is, in practice, people with different temperaments or different practical concerns will indeed draw different conclusions. And for the voluntarist, this diversity of responses should just be accepted. Whereas traditional epistemology hopes that we will discover the rules that will determine the uniquely rational response to the evidence, the voluntarist is just happy to accept that, first of all, when we reflect on our practice, it seems unlikely that there are such rules, and perhaps we don't really even need such rules, right? It's fine for people to draw different conclusions in this kind of way. Okay, then. So, that's one argument there, one general argument in favour of the voluntarist approach. Another part of the argument for voluntarism comes from reflecting on the history of science. Van Fraassen introduces this by contrasting voluntarist epistemology with what he calls objectifying epistemology. Objectifying epistemology involves the construction of a kind of descriptive or perhaps even quasi-scientific theory of cognition, a theory that describes how human minds function so as to produce true beliefs. An objectifying epistemology is an epistemology that consists in a factual theory about human cognitive functioning. And the claim that Van Fraassen makes is that a great deal of contemporary epistemology is in the form of objectifying epistemology. So one obvious example of this, which takes a kind of coherentist line, is Quine's naturalised epistemology. Quine argued that epistemology should simply become a chapter of cognitive science. Epistemology studies belief and theory formation in the human subject. All humans receive a certain pattern of sensory stimulation. In response to this, they produce various descriptions or models of the way the world is. Cognitive science will give us theories of how this process works. And once we have said how this works, well, that's all there is to be said as far as epistemology is concerned. So in Quine's hands, epistemology just becomes a theory of human cognition, quite literally. It just becomes part of science. So that's one example, quite an influential example of an objectifying epistemology. But objectifying epistemology is much, much broader than this. So many theological epistemologies are also objectifying epistemologies, because religious commitments, just like the sciences, can give us a picture of what humans are like and how humans function. So we might appeal to this in constructing our epistemology. We might say, for instance, that God created mankind, that God has furnished our minds with certain innate ideas, that God is good and so will not deceive us and will want us to be able to learn the facts of creation. Again, right, an objectifying epistemology is any epistemology that purports to be a factual theory of cognition, of how humans form reliable beliefs. And so, as such, it involves a commitment to a particular picture of the way the world is. That picture might be provided by the sciences, but it could be provided by religion or whatever else. Van Fraassen says that like much of the work in externalism, internalism, reliabilism, inductivism, foundationalism, all of this involves objectifying epistemology. So Van Fraassen says that all of these epistemologies face what he thinks is a fatal problem, which is that they are unable to account for the rationality of revolutionary theory change. So, first of all, the assumption here is that we can take science to be an exemplar of rational inquiry, so that our epistemological theory had better not render science irrational. Van Fraassen is an empiricist, so it's unsurprising that he makes this assumption, but this is something that is reasonably uncontroversial, right? So, I mean, the claim here is not that science is the only type of rational activity or anything like that. It's just an exemplar. It's something that should be ruled as rational by our epistemology, even if we take other things to be rational as well. And I think this is something that most epistemologists would agree with, right? That like, generally speaking, science, when it works properly, at least, that counts as rational inquiry. So, when we look at the history of science, what we find is that it sometimes undergoes revolutions. The worldviews that are presented by science at a given time are sometimes displaced. Think of the transition from Aristotelian cosmology to Newtonian mechanics to general relativity and quantum mechanics, or Ptolemaic astronomy to heliocentric astronomy to our modern view of the universe, or the phlogiston theory of combustion to the oxidation theory of combustion. Look across scientific disciplines, you don't always see a pattern of gradual cumulative change where we're just like kind of learning more and more and more and more about the world. Occasionally there are these rifts where theories are thrown out and entirely new approaches are developed. Now, even if in practice it turns out that our current theories remain stable, we all recognise that in principle such revolutions might occur again. And in particular, as far as human cognition is concerned, right, our theories of how human cognition works might undergo a revolution. But in general, scientists put their theories against the tribunal of experience, and they always recognise that, in principle, right, the theories might have to be abandoned in the face of unexpected results. And importantly, it's not just beliefs that change through revolutions. The new paradigm after a revolution may use different methodologies, different standards of theory evaluation, or it may interpret shared standards of evaluation differently. People often talk about the scientific method as though it's this single thing fixed for all time that guides all scientific research. And I suppose if you state it abstractly enough, then maybe that's true. So, if you were to say, propose a hypothesis, derive a prediction from the hypothesis, test the prediction, right? Something along those lines. Maybe that's the scientific method. But, think about it in more detail, right? How exactly should a scientist go about testing a prediction? Well, now we have to get into the more nitty-gritty elements of experimental design and data analysis and so on, and methods for that will change. So we develop methods like blind and double-blind experiments, or tools in probability theory like Bayesian techniques, or tools like analysis of variance or whatever. Similarly, the standards of evaluation can shift. So to take one example, in the early modern era, physical theories were expected to specify causal or mechanical processes. One of the early objections to Newtonian mechanics was that it failed to provide any kind of mechanism for gravity. Gravity, in the hands of Newton, was an occult force. Many scientists favoured Descartes' vortex theory, which treated gravity as a product of whirlpools of cosmic matter, because Descartes' theory could actually specify the mechanical action of particles such that they produce gravity. Newton left this unexplained. And for a long time that was seen as a problem for Newtonian mechanics. But as the incredible empirical successes of Newtonian mechanics accumulated, while other theories like Descartes' vortex theory just failed to get anywhere, scientists stopped caring about mechanical explanation. Theories today are no longer expected to provide these kinds of mechanical explanations of the sort that Descartes attempted to give. We have no problem talking about forces and fields and other phenomena that would seem almost paranormally occult to the early modern scientist. So, in a scientific revolution, we find that ontology, methods, and norms of theory evaluation can be up for grabs. What is the point of all of this? Well, the problem for objectifying epistemologies is that they are heavily integrated with the currently accepted scientific worldview. A theory that tells us how the world works together with human cognitive functioning to produce reliable belief must draw on the theories that encapsulate our current view of the world, and in particular our current view of humans, human minds, human brains. But then, from the point of view of the objectifying epistemology, a revolution in our view of how we fit into the world would have to be viewed as irrational. So as Van Fraassen says, if we are to write a theory about our cognitive activities and their adequacy, we'll have to draw on the very theories that encapsulate our present view of the world. But if we do so, the result will simply rule out as impossible any way of coming to know that we ourselves don't fit our present view of the world. The point here is that any epistemology that works by describing a way the world is, and a way that humans are such that humans can get knowledge, this cannot license the claim that under certain conditions we could come to know that things are not this way. So suppose that our epistemology tells us that humans were created by God, that God furnished our minds with certain innate ideas that will reliably guide us in our interaction with the world. Well then, from the point of view of this epistemology, we cannot come to know that humans were not so created. If we adopt an alternative view of the origin of humanity, well, from the point of view of this epistemology, we've lost any possible justification for any of our beliefs, including whatever beliefs led us to find the alternative view attractive in the first place. Because, after all, what justifies our beliefs is that they're based on innate ideas that we know are reliable because of the existence of a good God that grounds their reliability. Right? If we lose that theory of the origin of humans, we lose justification for our beliefs. And the same problem is going to arise for any epistemology grounded in a scientific theory of cognition. I guess there's different ways of filling this in, right? Like, humans are animals, they've evolved with a particular set of drives and inclinations. The kind of environments in which we lived will have inculcated us with inclinations to respond to experience in particular ways. Or we might give a model of how the brain responds to sensory stimulation to provide reliable representations, whatever. However it is that we fill in the details of these ideas, it will be that from the point of view of these epistemologies, we cannot come to know that things do not happen in this way. So, in general, for objectifying epistemology, any conceptual revolution that takes us out of the theories that ground the objectifying epistemology must be treated as cognitive dysfunction, as irrational. The objectifying epistemology will fail to survive the revolution, and it will rule the revolution as irrational. So this is the problem. Objectifying epistemology involves a theory of cognition. This theory of cognition must be based on our current scientific knowledge, but any epistemology constructed on our current theories will make conceptual revolution of those theories irrational. But we've seen revolutions take place in the history of science, and so we need a conception of epistemology that licenses revolution, both obviously in the past and perhaps even in the future. Remember, we're open to the idea, we should be open to the idea, at least in principle, right, that our theories might radically change. So that's the problem with objectifying epistemology. By contrast, voluntarist epistemology is not descriptive. It does not involve a model of human cognition. It is not integrated with the prevailing scientific paradigm. Voluntarism therefore allows for radical changes in worldview. Perhaps one way to think about the contrast between objectifying and voluntarist epistemology is in terms of the attitudes towards science. Most contemporary epistemologists have a positive attitude to science, but what impresses the objectifying epistemologists is the content of science. So think of people like Quine, right? So the idea is, objectifying epistemologists tend to be struck by the success of our current theories, and they tend to be impressed by the explanatory power of the images of the world provided by those theories. So the epistemology is then constructed in line with those images. On the other hand, what impresses Van Fraassen and the voluntarists is not the content of science, but the process of science, the way in which all scientific theories are open to empirical test. Any of them is vulnerable to being defeated. That's what opens up the possibility of radical theory change, and Van Fraassen says voluntarism aligns with this much better than does objectifying epistemology. And you can sort of see, again, so voluntarism resists the idea that there are rules determining what beliefs we should adopt. And when we actually look at the sort of details of scientific theory change, again, the claim will be that voluntarism tends to align with this better. So, during a scientific revolution, scientists face a difficult decision. The old paradigm can boast many successors, but it also exhibits certain troubling anomalies. There will be phenomena that have proved recalcitrant, that nobody has figured out how to fit into the theory. Or perhaps the theory will contain certain ad hoc hypotheses that seem inelegant. The new paradigm will solve some of these problems, but at the same time, because it's new, it hasn't really had the opportunity to be so thoroughly tested or criticised. So perhaps the new theory will not meet the expectations of its supporters, or perhaps we will figure out some way to resolve the crisis in terms of the old theory. Or perhaps some ingenious maverick will come up with a third theory that does better than both of them. In this kind of situation, all you can do is take a bet. And there are no rules. There are no rules of rationality to guide us here. We judge theories against a host of different values: empirical accuracy, simplicity, explanatory scope, fruitfulness for further research. Every scientist will interpret these values somewhat differently, and every scientist will weigh them somewhat differently. So just as with James's two goals of maximising truth and avoiding error, these different standards will sometimes come into conflict. And then we're going to have to make a choice about how to weigh them. Like sometimes there might be a theory that is simpler, but that faces some tricky, some apparently refuting evidence. Like we haven't figured out a way of capturing certain phenomena within that theory. Again, that there might be some theory that is very, very accurate but hopelessly complex, right? So some scientists will be sticklers for making theories conform with precise experimental data. Other scientists will put a great deal of weight on having simple general theories of great mathematical elegance, and they won't be particularly concerned if there's a few phenomena that are difficult to account for. Paul Dirac once said of Einstein's relativity theory, and I quote, "The foundations of the theory are, I believe, stronger than what one could get simply from the support of experimental evidence. The real foundations come from the great beauty of the theory. It is the essential beauty of the theory which I feel is the real reason for believing in it." So scientists like Dirac might be inclined to disregard a few failed predictions. They might be inclined to assume that in the fullness of time, flaws in the experiments will be uncovered. After all, most new theories face some anomalous experimental results. Indeed, relativity theory actually faced some anomalous results from the experiments of Dayton Miller, who claimed to have detected evidence of ether drift. It was only in the 1950s, long after the scientific community had already accepted relativity theory, that Miller's results were conclusively refuted by Robert Shankland. So we judge theories against values we take to be important, and then we make a commitment. We stick our necks out, and that's the best that we can do. Again, we stick our necks out. We cannot put the responsibility onto rules of rationality. It is up to us to take whatever risks we find appropriate. Okay then, so that's voluntarism. What I want to do now is turn to some objections. Well, one major objection to voluntarism is that it leads to a kind of arbitrariness. Because under voluntarism, we adopt certain beliefs and certain methods for getting ourselves to new beliefs, but it seems that we have no particular reason for doing so. After all, under voluntarism, very different beliefs and very different epistemic policies will turn out to be rational. But in acknowledging this, am I not also acknowledging that there are just no good reasons for holding one set of beliefs rather than another? I mean, if I judge that theory T1 is just as good as T2, then I have no way to choose between them. I should suspend judgment, shouldn't I? Or at least if I do pick one, I might as well have just flipped a coin. So Van Fraassen would say, I think, that the fact that I take T1 and T2 as both rationally permissible does not entail that I judge T1 and T2 to be equally good, or that I have no reasons for preferring one to the other. I can offer reasons for preferring T1 to T2 without supposing that these reasons would or should be compelling for all people. I mean, in general, right, we can think about, so there are going to be many different factors that will nudge people towards one belief rather than another. A particular belief might be more intuitive to me, in the sense that it's more in line with my prior expectations about the world, or it might bring me some sort of comfort, or it might be more easy to apply in practice, more easy to draw general inferences from it, or it might, I don't know, resonate with my personality in some way. Maybe I'm more inclined to adopt an unpopular theory because I have contrarian inclinations. Of course, all of these factors might explain the psychology of the belief, but you'd still probably say, well, do these provide reasons for belief? I mean, we might not take them, like, certainly, if I say that I believe something because it's comforting, that's pretty lame, right? We don't think of that as providing any reason for the belief. I mean, so part of this does depend on what exactly reason for belief is supposed to consist in. In practice, like in actual conversations, if you were to ask me, what are your reasons for believing that P, you would expect me to offer considerations that might incline you to the belief also, or considerations that are connected in some way to the truth of the belief. So for instance, let's say, there's a conversation and we say, what are your reasons for believing moral realism? Well, then you'd expect me to give you a justification for moral realism that you might find compelling, or something that's connected to the truth of moral realism. So then, if I'm defending moral realism, which I wouldn't, because I'm not a moral realist, that might have been a bad example, but we'll go with it. So if I'm defending moral realism, then I'm going to have to present some factor that we hold in common, that I think you could be, or that I think you could be persuaded to hold in common with me. But while I can do this, I can offer considerations that sort of try to appeal to to the sort of background opinion that you have in favour of moral, that would then incline you in favour of moral realism, right? I can do this. I can suppose that these reasons might incline you in some way towards moral realism without supposing that these reasons are rationally compelling. So I can say, look, moral realism makes the best sense of these features of our moral discourse, even if I acknowledge that to somebody with a completely different background and completely different values, that would not be persuasive. I can make moral realism seem more attractive, and that's basically as far as it goes. That might simply involve illustrating why somebody with my background beliefs and values would endorse moral realism. But I mean, like, at a certain point, yes, right, the voluntarist will just say, well, like, the whole point of this position is that there are no rules that compel any particular set of beliefs. You can give reasons that might incline people in one way or another, but that's it. So perhaps the most obvious objection is that voluntarism is just absurdly permissive. Again, the claim here is that rational constraint, the only rational constraint is consistency. Beyond that, an agent can rationally believe anything at all. And there are several ways of objecting that voluntarism is too permissive here. So, first of all, one claim might be, well, voluntarism licenses beliefs that are plainly ridiculous. Do we really want to say that a flat earther is rational just in case her views happen to be consistent? Or to use an example from James Ladyman, what about somebody who believes that shooting people in the head is an effective way to cure migraine? On voluntarism, there isn't, in principle, anything irrational about making the inductive inference that shooting myself in the head will restore me to full health. But to say that that's not irrational, to say that that's rationally permissible, just seems totally outrageous. So in response to this, it's important to bear in mind that consistency is actually a pretty strong constraint, especially when we're dealing with a whole belief system. I can't just choose what to believe, partly because I can't just come up with a consistent web of belief which includes these apparently absurd propositions. Given my background beliefs, flat earth theory is straightforwardly ruled out. So there is not, like, in itself any inconsistency in flat Earth theory, or at least like the proposition that the Earth is flat is not in itself inconsistent. But I can't even imagine a set of beliefs that would be plausible to me and that would be consistent with flat Earth theory. The same, of course, is true for the notion of shooting to alleviate migraine. This conflicts with so much of what we take ourselves to know about how the world works, so many of the sources that we consider credible. Even if there is, in principle, some consistent web of belief on which these claims are true, these webs of belief are inaccessible and currently unintelligible to us. I mean, recall here the pragmatist elements of voluntarism, right? We have no choice but to start from where we are now. We begin inquiry with a certain body of opinion. The fact that there might, in principle, be alternative coherent webs of belief which contain what we think of as absurdities is just irrelevant to us. So another way, then, to push the permissiveness objection is suggested by Paul Dicken in his book on Van Fraassen's constructive empiricism. Dicken points out that, on the voluntarist account, there is nothing irrational about simply ignoring information. Consider the flat earther who, on being asked to explain why the Earth looks round in photographs, simply denies that it does. So you hold a photograph up to her, ask why the Earth looks round, and she either denies that you're holding a photograph or just chooses to completely ignore you. She refuses even to acknowledge the existence of any problematic evidence. Or think about a creationist who, when asked to explain the fossil record, just denies that there is a fossil record, or just ignores the question. In these cases, it's not that the flat earther and the creationist are giving bad explanations. It's not that, it's not like a creationist who says, well, God put them there to test our faith, when talking about fossils. Rather, we're imagining a case where they just deny that any explanation is required because they deny or ignore the evidence. Neither of these moves is irrational on a voluntarist conception of rationality, because it's not inconsistent. But again, this seems absurd. This seems too liberal. So I think the best move for the voluntarist here is to grant that, although this might be possible in principle, right, this isn't how anybody would ever actually react to being presented with evidence. So, of course, a flat earther could just ignore you when you show them a photograph of the Earth. But when you do that, right, when you present the photograph, that will have some sort of effect on them. It will influence their beliefs. They will come to believe, at the very least, that there are other people who believe that there are photographs of the Earth. They may not admit this, right, but they would believe it. In general, we can't really control the way that perceptual experience impresses itself upon us. So, the things that you perceive will lead to various beliefs about the world, even if you prefer it not to admit it. So, again, like I suppose this point is like in practice, then this isn't really going to be a problem. Like the idea of somebody just ignoring information in this kind of way probably isn't going to happen. But I mean, yeah, I don't know how satisfying that response is. Probably isn't going to happen, but if it did happen, I'm not sure that the voluntarist could say that there's anything particularly irrational about it. Okay, here's a third worry about voluntarism's permissiveness. Consider instead the person who attempts to avoid error at all costs. They desire to minimize error, and this always overrides any concern for increasing true belief. This person will simply hold very few or no beliefs at all about the external world. They suspend judgment about every empirical proposition. Well, according to the voluntarist, there's nothing irrational about this kind of radical skepticism, because it's consistent, or it's not inconsistent. And so the issue here is that the voluntarist understands self-sabotage simply in terms of failures of logical consistency. But we might think that there are other kinds of self-sabotage that are relevant. So in particular, this kind of total suspension of judgment, we might argue, leads to a kind of practical self-sabotage. Since the skeptic holds no beliefs, and can form no expectations about the outcomes of her actions, she will be unable to perform any action. If she wants to leave a building, she has no more reason to take the stairs than to jump out of the window, or to just remain still and wait for the building to move around her. In order to perform actions, every agent needs to, stick their neck out and make some inductive inferences. The skeptic sabotages herself because she undermines the possibility of engaging in any successful action. This is a broader notion of self-sabotage than logical self-sabotage. It's practical self-sabotage. So we can ask the voluntarist why exactly self-sabotage should be conceived only in terms of logical self-sabotage. And one way to make this kind of challenge a bit more forceful is to suggest that actually even the voluntarist is using a notion of practical self-sabotage. What is it, after all, that's really wrong with probabilistic incoherence, with violating the axioms of probability theory? Well, as we saw, it's because you render yourself liable to Dutch books. So the problem with probabilistic incoherence is that it's guaranteed to lead you to perform actions that will make you worse off. But now we seem to be justifying the use of probability theory as a constraint on rational belief by appealing to practical considerations. And I think, more generally, we can ask, why does it matter if beliefs sabotage their own possibility of vindication? Why does it matter if I'm irrational? It's quite natural to answer that by appealing to practical consequences. And if the voluntarist is already appealing to a notion of practical self-sabotage in order to explain what's wrong with logical self-sabotage, then it looks like logical self-sabotage isn't the only constraint on rational belief. So yeah, I guess that those are several different ways of forwarding what I take it would be the primary objection to voluntarism, that it is too permissive. It counts too many sets of beliefs as rational. But we might also object that in other ways voluntarism is too conservative, that the voluntarist is mistaken in treating consistency as a universal constraint on rational belief. There are a couple of problems with consistency here. First of all, we might argue that there are cases where, although inconsistency guarantees that at least one belief is false, it's still rational to accept an inconsistent set of beliefs. Consider the preface paradox. Authors of non-fiction books will often include a preface noting that there might be... I've just remembered somebody left a comment on one of my videos before, laughing at the way that I said preface as preface. I believe it's actually supposed to be pronounced preface, or something like that. But I don't care about pronunciation, and I find preface more amusing than preface, so that's what I'm going to use. Anyway, consider the preface paradox. I mean preface paradox, damn it! I intended to keep using preface and I failed immediately. Okay. Let's just move on. So authors of non-fiction books will often include a preface noting that there might be errors or claiming responsibility for errors within. They'll say things like, the errors found within this book are my responsibility. So the book contains many assertions, each of which, taken individually, the author believes is true. But the author does not believe the conjunction of all those assertions. She expects that at least a few of those assertions are actually false, although she doesn't know which. Now, this is obviously inconsistent. She believes A is true, B is true, C is true, etc. But the conjunction A and B and C, etc. is not true. So she believes that her book both does and does not contain an error. And so she has an inconsistency in her beliefs, but this seems totally rational. This seems, that seems like the right degree of kind of epistemic humility. Of course, I acknowledge that not all of my beliefs are going to be right. Now, any example like this does have multiple proposed solutions. The obvious line to take on something like the preface paradox, I think, is to frame it in terms of degrees of belief. When we say that the author believes that each proposition in the book is true, we are actually idealizing a more complex mental state. It's rather, that she'll be like 95% sure that A is true, 99% sure that B is true, 90% sure that C is true. She'll be more or less inclined, right, to each of these propositions. And in that case, there is absolutely nothing inconsistent about assigning a high probability to the claim that the conjunction of all these propositions is false. Indeed, probability theory would require you to assign a high probability to that. So if you're like, you know, if you've got like, you know, 1,000 propositions and each proposition you are saying is you're 95% sure that each of them is true, then for the whole conjunction of those propositions, you're rationally required to assign a high probability that is false. Right. So, you know, there are ways out of this kind of problem. A second problem with the voluntarists' consistency criterion is that there are some philosophers who outright state that there can be contradictions, true contradictions. These are the dialetheists, like Graham Priest. For Priest, consistency in our theories is a virtue, but it's only one virtue among many, and it can be outweighed by others, like simplicity, explanatory power, unification. The voluntarist has to count Priest as irrational, but, you know, even if we think that Priest is wrong, I mean, it's not clear that he's made any greater of an error than any other philosopher with incorrect beliefs, right? Like, do we want to say that dialetheism is just obviously wrong in a different way to all sorts of other beliefs that we find absurd, but that would be perfectly rationally permissible according to voluntarism? Furthermore, recall the voluntarists' objection to objectifying epistemologies. The problem was claimed to be that they failed to account for the rationality of scientific revolutions. But if we look at the history of logic, we similarly find changes to our logical theories over time. The dialetheists argue that the work is unfinished and that we need to replace classical logic with some sort of paraconsistent logic. And dialetheism is just one part of what's actually a very lively debate among philosophers of logic. The question, what is the correct logic, right? What is the correct logical theory? Indeed, can there be a correct logical theory? What exactly is the relation between formal logical theories and good reasoning? Perhaps formal logic always involves an idealization of reasoning, so that good reasoning cannot be entirely captured by any formal logical theory. What's more, many arguments for revising logic are actually grounded in empirical work. Hilary Putnam, in his article, Is Logic Empirical?, famously suggested that quantum mechanics provides good reason for revising classical logic. The radical changes in worldview wrought by scientific revolutions may also prompt changes in how we conceive of logic, but it's not clear how the voluntarist can make sense of the rationality of any of these debates. Now, you know, we might just bite the bullet on this kind of thing. I'm sure there are plenty of people who would be happy to say that dialetheism is straightforwardly irrational, or, you know, that maybe there's something defective about the very idea of debating the laws of logic. Okay, you know, fine. The point, though, is that this kind of theoretical conservatism does seem to be in some tension with the voluntarists' extraordinarily permissive view of empirical debate. You know, like the voluntarist wants to allow for the rationality of radical changes in our worldview, but then that stops at logic, even though there are plenty of intelligent, professional philosophers who think that there might be changes coming there. So, you know, again, there's maybe a bit of a tension here. Right, well, that's it. That is voluntarism. That's all I'm talking about for today. Goodbye.